Hello everyone, John AG here. Welcome back to my channel, Aurex. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to my channel. In this channel, you will find the real information, the real market updates that everyone else cannot or will not tell you. So please subscribe to this channel. I love all of my subscribers for your incredible support. And please watch this video till the very end, because YouTube's algorithm is a difficult beast, and it will not push my videos to more people unless you stay with me through the whole story. The mainstream machine actively suppresses this kind of macroeconomic truth, and I need your watch time to break through the static. Make sure you hit that like button, and let's dive into the reality of what is happening around us right now. Today is May 8th, 2026. Take a deep breath and look around you. The world outside your window might seem perfectly normal. The birds are still singing, the cars are still driving down the street, and the local coffee shop is still serving your morning brew. But do not let this facade of normalcy deceive you. Beneath the surface of this everyday routine, the very bedrock of the global financial system has just suffered a catastrophic, terminal fracture. We are not experiencing a mere market correction, a temporary cyclical downturn, or a passing recession. We are standing at the absolute precipice of a $2.1 trillion sovereign debt default. This is an event of such colossal magnitude that it will permanently rewrite the rules of wealth, power, and human freedom for the next century. For decades, the G7 nations, the United States, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the United Kingdom, have ruled the globe unchallenged. They dictated terms through the absolute supremacy of their fiat currencies and the seemingly infinite depth of their sovereign debt markets. They exported their inflation, they weaponized their banking systems, and they operated under the arrogant assumption that the rest of the world would endlessly finance their deficits. But what happens when the world's biggest credit card suddenly gets declined? That is exactly what just happened. The rules of the global game have violently changed, and the East and the global South have abruptly stopped playing. Central banks across the globe, led by a highly coordinated coalition of rising economic powers, have begun to systematically weaponize physical gold. They are actively turning the ultimate, ancient, silent asset into a modern financial guillotine poised directly over the neck of the Western financial empire. This is not a theoretical exercise in a university economics class. This is not just about red and green candles on a trading chart or basis points discussed in a sterilized central bank press conference. This is intimately and aggressively about your life. This is about the purchasing power of your life savings, the security of your home, the viability of your pension, and the harsh reality of the world your children will inevitably inherit. To truly understand why the foundations of the earth are shaking today, we must look directly at the terrifying anatomy of this number, $2.1 trillion. In the spring of 2026, a massive, unprecedented wall of sovereign debt from the G7 nations was scheduled to be rolled over. For those who might not be deep into the weeds of institutional finance, rolling over debt is the macroeconomic equivalent of paying off a maxed-out credit card by simply opening a new credit card. Governments rarely actually pay down the principal of their staggering national debts. Instead, they continuously issue brand new bonds to raise the cash needed to pay off the old bonds that are maturing. It is a perpetual motion machine fueled entirely by faith and confidence. But this week, when the G7 treasuries proudly went to the open market to sell their new round of debt, their shiny new credit cards, a chilling silence echoed through the halls of global finance. The buyers simply weren't there. For the first time in the modern post-World War II era, a massive, coordinated auction for Western government securities catastrophically failed. A staggering $2.1 trillion in sovereign debt found absolutely no bidders at interest rates that the governments could actually afford to pay. In the sterile language of high finance, this is known as a technical default. When a sovereign government, especially one of the G7, cannot find willing entities to lend them the capital required to service what they already owe, the grand, decades-long illusion of the risk-free asset violently evaporates. While we were distracted by digital illusions, they were quietly emptying the physical vaults. Why did this historic failure occur right now, in 2026? Because the very definition of a store of value has been ruthlessly redefined by the nations that actually produce the world's tangible goods. For over 80 years since the Bretton Woods Agreement, the US dollar, and later the euro, were considered the unshakable bedrock of the global economy. You held these currencies in your central bank reserves because you were told they were as good as gold. But over the last 5 years, the G7 made a fatal, hubristic miscalculation. They chose to use their swift financial messaging system and their reserve currencies as outright geopolitical weapons. They aggressively froze the sovereign assets of foreign nations. They abruptly kicked entire populations out of the international payment systems, and they relentlessly printed trillions of new currency units to fund domestic deficits until the very ink on the paper lost its intrinsic value. The rest of the world watched this unfold with wide eyes, and more importantly, they learned. They realized a terrifying truth. If you hold your national wealth, your surplus labor, and your sovereign savings in another man's fiat currency, you are merely a tenant in the global financial system, not an owner. You are subject to eviction at any moment. While the Western public was deeply distracted by the latest tech stock bubbles, social media algorithms, and fleeting digital currency crazes, the central banks of the rest of the world, spearheaded by the expanded BRICS Plus coalition, were quietly and methodically executing a brilliant, decades-long master plan. They weren't simply buying gold as a passive hedge against inflation. They were actively weaponizing it to dismantle the debt-based hegemony of the West. Throughout 2024, 2025, and culminating in the explosive events of early 2026, we witnessed an unprecedented historic repatriation of physical gold. Sovereign nations ranging from Poland and Hungary to India, Saudi Arabia, and China began forcefully demanding their physical gold bars back from the deep custodial vaults of London and New York. They fundamentally rejected the concept of a paper claim on gold. They demanded the heavy, yellow, unprintable, uncancelable reality of physical bullion delivered to their own sovereign soil. By systematically shifting their vast national reserves away from G7 government bonds and redirecting that massive capital flow into physical gold, these allied central banks effectively pulled the structural rug out from under the entire Western debt market. The fundamental logic driving this maneuver is brilliantly simple, yet utterly devastating to the G7. Every single ounce of gold that a foreign central bank purchases is $1 or €1 that they deliberately chose not to buy. When the world's most prolific savers, the nations that physically extract the oil from the ground, harvest the grain, refine the rare earth metals, and manufacture the microchips, collectively stop purchasing G7 debt and simultaneously start hoarding gold, the G7's fundamental ability to fund its vast, unfunded liabilities instantly vanishes. This is the ultimate gold trap. By aggressively driving the global price of physical gold to record stratospheric highs, while strictly refusing to bid on Western debt auctions, the East is intentionally forcing the G7 into an inescapable hyperinflationary death spiral. The mathematics of this ruin are cold, precise, and entirely unforgiving. Behind the closed doors of the Treasury departments, policymakers are staring at a mathematical reality they can no longer manipulate. When the interest rate required to attract buyers for sovereign debt exceeds the actual economic growth of the nation, debt compounds exponentially. In formal macroeconomic terms, the structural trap the G7 finds itself in is defined by the sovereign debt dynamic. $T equals $T minus 1 plus R, plus $T minus $T. In this unforgiving equation, $D represents the total crushing national debt. $R is the real interest rate demanded by the market. $G is government spending, and $T is tax revenue. For years, central banks artificially suppressed dollar to near zero, allowing governments to borrow infinitely. But the weaponization of gold has shattered that control. The market is now violently demanding a higher dollar to compensate for the extreme risk of holding debased fiat. Because $G spending remains stubbornly high and $T taxes cannot be raised enough without destroying the working class, the only way to satisfy this equation is absolute, unadulterated money printing. To cover that failed $2.1 trillion auction without real buyers, the central banks of the West were forced to do the exact thing they swore they had stopped doing. They became the buyer of last resort for their own toxic debt. The immediate result? The currency sitting in your wallet, your checking account, and your hard-earned 401k just suffered a catastrophic loss of purchasing power in a matter of weeks. They did not raise your taxes through legislation. They silently taxed your wealth through the stealth mechanism of currency debasement. I need to step away from the macroeconomic theory for a moment and talk to you directly, human to human. When analysts, politicians, and talking heads on financial networks discuss debt defaults, yield curve inversions, and currency weaponization, the language sounds incredibly cold, distant, and clinical. It sounds like something abstract that only happens in a mahogany-lined boardroom in Basel, Switzerland, or behind the heavily guarded doors of Washington, D.C. But the brutal, bleeding reality of this crisis is not found on a Bloomberg terminal. It is found right now at the local grocery store checkout line. It is found in the desperate, tired eyes of a father who just logged into his retirement account and realized his safe, conservative pension plan has lost half of its true purchasing power in a mere 36 months. I read the emails and messages from the Aurex community every single day, and the stories break my heart. I hear from a grandmother in Manchester who is wrapping herself in blankets because she literally cannot afford to turn on the heat. The natural gas she needs is priced in a global market that is openly rejecting her collapsing currency. I hear from a brilliant young entrepreneur in Ohio who poured his soul into a startup, only to see the interest rate on his variable business loan triple in 6 months because the government's supposedly risk-free borrowing rate skyrocketed out of control. I hear from single mothers who are secretly skipping meals just so they can afford to put protein on the table for their children. They tell you the economy is just a spreadsheet, but the economy is your life. This is the deeply tragic human touch of this financial crisis. This is the collateral damage of hubris. The political and financial leadership of the G7 spent the last 20 years arrogantly telling the public that deficits don't matter, that we owe the debt to ourselves, and that modern monetary theory would allow us to print our way to perpetual prosperity. But as the dust settles on this $2.1 trillion default, we are discovering exactly who ourselves actually is. Ourselves turned out to be the hollowed-out middle class. It turned out to be the blue-collar workers, the diligent savers, and the honest citizens who played by the rules their entire lives, only to be handed the catastrophic bill for decades of extreme fiscal recklessness. We are living through a grand devaluation, not just of money, but of human effort itself. Think about it deeply. If you worked 40 exhausting hours a week in the year 2020, the capital you generated from that labor bought you a specific, predictable standard of living. You could afford a mortgage, car payments, and a vacation. Today, in 2026, you are still trading those same 40 hours of your finite, precious, unrecoverable life, but your labor buys you drastically less. Your actual life force is being siphoned away at the source through the intentional debasement of the currency you are paid in. This is far beyond a simple failure of economic policy. It is a profound moral failure of the highest order. Why has gold been chosen as the ultimate instrument of this financial revolution? In a modern world characterized by a total breakdown of institutional trust, a post-trust era where media, governments, and banks have routinely lied to the public, gold stands alone. Gold is the only Tier 1 financial asset on the planet that does not require the signature, the promise, or the performance of a politician to retain its value. It is the only asset that is not simultaneously someone else's liability. When you hold a physical ounce of gold, you hold pure, unencumbered, counterparty-free wealth. The allied central banks of the East are currently utilizing their massive gold reserves to engineer a completely parallel global financial architecture. We are bearing witness to the real-time birth of a gold-backed, commodity-centric settlement system designed specifically for international sovereign trade. When a producing nation can confidently sell 1 million barrels of oil and immediately settle that transaction in physical gold, or trade manufactured goods for tangible precious metals, they permanently sever their reliance on the G7's financial infrastructure. They no longer require the permission of Western capitals to engage in commerce. This moment, this $2.1 trillion fracture, marks the definitive, agonizing end of the unipolar moment. The illusion of absolute Western financial invincibility has been shattered on the global stage. The weaponization of gold is the final, undeniable checkmate on the geopolitical chessboard. It violently forces the central planners of the West into a corner where they must choose between two equally devastating poisons. Option 1 is a deflationary collapse. In this scenario, central banks stop the printing presses, allow interest rates to naturally float to their true market value of 15% or higher to attract real capital, and subsequently watch as the entire over-leveraged housing market, the commercial real estate sector, and the fragile regional banking system instantly vaporize into a catastrophic depression. Option 2 is a hyperinflationary meltdown. In this scenario, which is the path they are currently choosing, They continue to violently monetize the debt. They print the 2.1 trillion today, they print the 5 trillion tomorrow, and they turn the once mighty dollar and euro into rapidly depreciating pieces of paper, ultimately destroying the purchasing power of their own citizens to keep the government machinery running for just a few more months. The rest of the world has already analyzed these two terrible outcomes and made their definitive choice. They have quietly, methodically moved their wealth into the lifeboats while the band continues to play on the deck of the sinking ship. They hold the physical gold. They control the raw commodities. They possess the vital manufacturing base. The G7 simply holds the paper debt. They are about to offer you a cure that is fundamentally deadlier than the disease itself. So, where does this staggering reality leave you, the individual viewer sitting at home? This is the crucial part of the video, where I need your absolute undivided attention. This is the actionable, real information I promised you at the very beginning of this broadcast. In the coming days and weeks, the mainstream financial media will aggressively deploy a coordinated narrative. They will stare into the camera and calmly tell you that this $2.1 trillion auction failure is merely a technical glitch, a transitory liquidity event, or a temporary market dislocation. They will urge you to remain calm, to keep your capital locked inside the traditional banking system, and to trust the authorities. Simultaneously, governments will seize upon this very crisis, a crisis they engineered through decades of mismanagement, to introduce their ultimate mechanism of control, the central bank digital currency, or CBDC. They will present this programmable digital money as the miraculous, necessary savior of the financial system. They will claim it offers safety, security, and instantaneous transactions. Do not fall for this catastrophic deception. A CBDC is not a solution to the debt crisis. It is a digital prison designed to trap your wealth within a failing system. It is programmable currency that allows a central authority to dictate exactly what you can buy, when you can buy it, and where you can spend it. It allows them to enforce negative interest rates directly on your savings and instantly freeze your access to commerce if you step out of line. The introduction of CBDCs is the desperate final grasp for total control by a financial empire that knows it is rapidly losing its grip on global power. The weaponization of gold by the world's most powerful foreign central banks is not just a geopolitical maneuver. It is a massive, flashing neon warning sign directed specifically at the aware individual. If the most highly capitalized, deeply informed, and ruthlessly pragmatic financial institutions on the face of the earth are rapidly ditching Western fiat debt in favor of tangible physical assets, ask yourself this critical question. Why aren't you doing exactly the same thing? This $2.1 trillion default is the thief in the night. It is the exact, identifiable moment in history when the unwritten social contract was permanently and irreparably severed. For generations, the implicit agreement between the citizen and the state was beautifully simple. Work hard, pay your taxes, save a portion of your income in the national currency, and the system will faithfully protect the value of your labor for your retirement. That contract has been torn to shreds and burned in the fires of inflation. We are aggressively entering the era of hard assets. The paradigm has shifted entirely. Whether your chosen vehicle for preservation is physical gold and silver resting securely in your own possession, productive agricultural land that yields tangible resources, or decentralized, immutable digital systems that exist entirely outside the manipulative reach of any central banking authority, the ultimate objective remains absolutely identical: sovereignty. You can no longer rely on a financial advisor who simply allocates your wealth into a traditional 60-40 portfolio of stocks and government bonds. You can no longer trust that the digits on your banking app represent real, enduring purchasing power. You must radically shift your mindset. You must forcefully take the reins of your own financial destiny. You must become your own central bank. You must acquire assets that have zero counterparty risk, assets that cannot be inflated away by a desperate Treasury Department trying to paper over a multi-trillion-dollar void. As we stare down the remainder of 2026 and look toward an incredibly uncertain future, the level of financial volatility we are about to experience will be unlike anything recorded in modern human history. We are watching the tectonic plates of global power violently shift. The G7 leadership will inevitably attempt a massive, systemic reset of the financial architecture to save themselves. You will begin to hear focus group-tested phrases pushed heavily in the media, terms like debt jubilee, comprehensive currency reform, or the Great Transition. You must understand that every single one of these sanitized phrases is simply a geopolitical euphemism for one brutal reality: a massive, unprecedented transfer of wealth away from the middle-class individuals who hold rapidly depreciating fiat currency, directly into the hands of the institutions and sovereign states that had the foresight to accumulate real, tangible assets. The $2.1 trillion default that occurred this week is merely the very first domino to fall in a very long, very terrifying sequence. Lurking ominously behind it is a staggering $300 trillion global debt bubble waiting to implode. The central banks of the East are far from finished with their economic offensive. They are patiently, strategically waiting for the exact moment when the G7 is paralyzed by domestic inflation and plunging bond markets to officially unveil a new, commodity-backed reserve settlement unit. When that inevitable announcement occurs, the shift away from the dollar system will not take decades. It will happen virtually overnight. The exorbitant privilege that the West has enjoyed for nearly a century will be instantly extinguished. However, I do not present this information to you today to spread fear, panic, or a sense of paralyzing doom and gloom. Quite the opposite. This is a message of intense reality and uncompromising readiness. If you study the long arc of monetary history, you quickly realize that these massive cycles of collapse and rebirth are entirely predictable. Empires invariably overextend their military and economic reach. They inevitably debase their foundational currency to pay for their overreach, and the global market eventually ruthlessly forces a transition to a new, sounder method of trade. Those who possess the courage to see the writing on the wall, to ignore the comforting lies of the mainstream narrative, and to take decisive, strategic action, do not merely survive these historical transitions, they position themselves to thrive exponentially. They build arcs of hard assets before the floodwaters rise. They fiercely protect the generational wealth of their families. They ensure that their labor is not stolen by the insidious hidden tax of inflation. Ultimately, the individuals who achieve true financial sovereignty today will become the economic foundation of the new world that must inevitably rise from the ashes of this collapsing, debt-fueled illusion. The G7 is currently being forced to stare into a harsh, unforgiving mirror, and for the very first time in over a century, they are deeply terrified by the reflection staring back at them. They see a fragile, hyper-leveraged system that has completely run out of runway, entirely run out of global trust, and most critically, thoroughly run out of physical gold. The relentless weaponization of gold by the East is not an act of emotional malice. It is simply an act of inescapable mathematics. You cannot print true wealth out of thin air. You can only print currency. And the global market has finally, definitively woken up to the massive difference between the two. I want to extend my deepest, most sincere gratitude to every single one of you who stayed with me throughout this entire intensive broadcast. We covered a tremendous amount of complex, heavy ground today, but these are the unvarnished truths we must boldly face if we wish to be properly prepared for the storm that has already made landfall. John A.G. here, and I am profoundly humbled by the strength, the intelligence, and the vigilance of the community we are steadily building together here on Aurex. You are the rare individuals who are actively seeking out the truth in a world drowning in manufactured deception. You are the ones who refuse to be led blindly like sheep into the slaughterhouse of the next engineered financial crisis. Please, if you found true value, insight, and clarity in this video, take immediate action to support this platform. Subscribe to the channel right now if you haven't already. Smash that like button. It sends a powerful, undeniable signal to the algorithmic gatekeepers that this raw truth matters and deserves to be seen by the masses. Share this exact video link with at least one person you truly care about. Do not let your friends and family be utterly blindsided by the devastating impact of this $2.1 trillion default wall. And please, comment down below. I want to hear your personal stories. Are you feeling the crushing weight of this intentional inflation in your daily life? What specific, tangible steps are you taking right now to secure your family's sovereignty? I read as many of your comments as humanly possible, and your insights fuel the fire of this channel. I love you all deeply for your unwavering support. It is solely because of your engagement and your hunger for reality that I can continue to bypass the traditional gatekeepers and tell the vital, unfiltered stories that the major financial networks are absolutely terrified to broadcast. Stay endlessly vigilant, stay fiercely sovereign, and I will see you in the next one. This is Aurex. This is the Real Market Update. Goodbye for now.